Welcome to An Honorable Profession, a podcast giving America hope since 2018. I'm Ryan Coonerty. Along with Debbie Cox Bultan of the New Deal, I'm lucky enough to be your co-host. An Honorable Profession is a New Deal Leaders podcast. The New Deal is an organization that supports the next generation of American leaders. From attorneys generals to state senators to mayors to school board members, these are the people that are pushing policies and politics that will respond to climate change, rebuild our economy, address racial injustice, and restore our democracy. These are incredibly talented people who have dedicated themselves to public service when their country and their communities needed it the most. Check out newdealleaders.org to see what I'm talking about.
In these final weeks of the campaign, there's plenty of attention on the presidential race, as well as significant media coverage of high-profile races for governor and Congress. But today, we're looking at some of the most important races happening around the country, state legislative elections. My guest is Heather Williams, president of the Democratic Legislative Campaign Committee, the party committee working to elect more Democrats to state houses and state senates and to win legislative majorities. Heather walks us through the strategy of targeting key states and legislative chambers, what opportunities she's most excited about this year, and the DLCC's important work to raise awareness of her candidates and make sure that voters vote down ballot as well as for the president. We also talk about what's at stake in this election and how so many of the issues that people care about are happening at the state and local level, from reproductive rights to housing, climate, and more. And we hear from Heather about her own path to this work, a path that mirrors many of the candidates she's now working to elect. I hope you enjoy. Heather Williams, welcome to An Honorable Profession.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here with you.
It's so nice to talk to you. I've been excited about this conversation for a while as we were heading into the home stretch. As mentioned, you are president of the Democratic Legislative Campaign Committee. And, so much of the attention, of course, as we head into November is focused on the presidential, rightfully so. But as you and I both know who work in state and local politics, so much of what happens in people's everyday lives matters of what happens at the state legislative level. So I'm excited to have you here just to talk a little bit about what you're seeing around the country and what your strategy or what you're most excited about, and what you're most worried about. So maybe I'll just dive in kind of with a big question about, when you think about what's at stake at this election at the state legislative level, like how, what's your framework for thinking about your work this year?
Oh, that's such a great question. I think about it actually in a couple of ways. One, we have real opportunities to build power in these states. And in today's time, in today's election, that means that we have an opportunity to put real leaders into these state capitals who are going to work for their communities, who are going to deliver on the promises that they made to voters, who are going to show up as leaders in the way in which we expect our leaders to show up. And so I think that's one way that I think about this election. I think the other way is thinking about, the stakes across the country. 12 races will determine the rights for millions of people. They will determine whether or not they have access to reproductive health care and abortion. They will determine whether or not, they've got strong voting laws and participation in our democracy. They will determine if our communities are safe and healthy through climate policies and common sense gun laws, good education for our kids. So I think about, contextualizing these, what happens in these state capitals matter to the people who live in the states, but the impact of state races and the dynamics of what is happening across the country in state houses is so much bigger than just that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And so when you're thinking about this year in particular, where are you looking? That's a stunning statistic, the 12 races. So tell me kind of however you break it down in your mind, like what is the landscape across the country look like for you in terms of where we have pickup opportunities, where we're defending things? What are your priorities this year?
Yeah. So, our work at DLCC as the party committee responsible for this ballot level, we look across, every election, and we identify exactly what you said, where the opportunities are, where we need to protect the power that we have, and where we have opportunities to build it. And this election, our work fits into sort of three buckets. One, it is protecting those new trifectas and new majorities that we built in 2022. The Minnesota House, protecting that trifecta, the Michigan House, protecting that chamber, that trifecta, the Pennsylvania House, protecting that chamber. Then we look at where there are opportunities to really challenge Republicans and work to flip chambers. Arizona, both chambers were just down by 2 seats in both of those chambers. In New Hampshire, where we've won a bunch of special elections in the New Hampshire House this year, I think setting them up for a real path to success in November. And in Wisconsin, where they have new maps and recruited great candidates across the state. The third bucket is, where do we need to build power and how do we define that for the future? Step number one is ensuring that our Democratic governors have the veto pen. So in North Carolina, it's ensuring that we move Democrats out of the superminority and return that veto pen back to what I feel fairly confident in saying will be incoming Governor Josh Stein. And in Kansas, giving Governor Laura Kelly that veto pen. And then looking right at opportunities across chambers in places like Georgia, where, making progress this election cycle will continue to set them up for greater success as we move through the decade.
Yeah, I was very lucky to talk to your predecessor a couple years ago, I think in the 2022 election cycle. And and we talked a little bit about the strategy of this idea that you talked about, your third bucket of where you can grow power. And it's so fun to hear. I remember very distinctly, now people can go back and check if this is true, but in my mind, I remembered very distinctly that she was talking about Arizona 2 years ago and needing to make it wasn't on the map last 2 years ago, but making enough gains that maybe to put it in play later. So to your point about kind of this multi-cycle view you have of basically making sure that third bucket is always moving forward so you have new opportunities is super exciting, actually, to hear the progress that you all have made. Maybe you could just tell people a little bit who aren't familiar with the DLCC, kind of how you do your work. What is it that you do on the day-to-day in the states where you're working and then across the country?
Yeah, so, we work similarly to our sister committees like the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, DCCC, or the DSCC, or the Democratic Governors Association. We are sort of soup to nuts, permanent presence in this ballot level with the sole mission, right, of building power. And so we're working hand in hand and arm with these campaigns and legislative leadership on the ground across the country. With obviously a bit of a focus on our battlegrounds, where there's that real power at stake in either direction. And, the cycle kind of looks like we start things off by identifying where the opportunities are in any given election cycle, identifying that, and then working to make sure that these campaigns are set up for success. Do they have the right fundraising mechanisms in place? Do they have the staff and leadership in place to recruit the dozens or hundreds, in the case of the New Hampshire House, of candidates needed, right, to run for office? How do we make sure that they have strong data so that when these candidates are on the doors, which is a really important part of our campaign work, making sure that there's strong community engagement and direct voter contact from our candidates, having those real conversations, making sure that they understand how voters feel about things, what they hope for, what they fear, what they're concerned about. And then as we move through the cycle, making sure that they have the resources to execute strong paid communication plans. And finally, right, making sure that we're getting our voters turned out. And what's interesting, I think, about that in the context of this election is, most of the legislative chambers that we just talked about are nested underneath core presidential battlegrounds. And, that means that there's a lot of activity in these states, but our job still needs to be that we're making sure that we're turning out voters in the districts that matter to build the majority, right? Because even though we're playing for sort of a statewide map, we're playing on obviously targeted districts within that. So really making sure that we're, strong adherence to what that target map is and making sure that the resources are going there so that we end on election day with a 50+1 chamber and a Democratic majority.
Yeah. It's such a daunting task, right? Actually, 50 states, as you said. I just, we had Rebecca Quokka on recently to talk about what's going on in New Hampshire, when a New Deal leader, and reminding our listeners about the 400, the biggest chamber in the country, outside Congress, at the state legislative level. And anyway, it's interesting to kind of hear you talk about how you how you target and make this, shrink the map in a way that's super strategic. You did mention kind of turning out voters. I'm curious kind of what your sense is on the ground. There seems to be a lot of enthusiasm, of course, for the Harris-Walz ticket, which is so exciting and wonderful. Do you how do you feel like it's going in terms of that translating to enthusiasm for state legislative candidates? And is it, and how do you know that? How do you watch that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think by all metrics, when you look at the grassroots support for the Harris-Walz campaign, when you look at the number of volunteers that they have gotten since the ticket was announced, when you look at kind of those measurements, you see, right, a lot of enthusiasm and interest. Our job in thinking about that, how do we apply and how do we grab onto that enthusiasm and bring it down into our ballot? We look at a couple of factors that are a little bit different than what you do statewide. One, we have to turn out folks in districts, and the districts that are most competitive are often not in urban centers, right? So we're looking at suburbs, we're looking at exurbs, we're looking at rural communities that make up these districts. We also are at a ballot level that is just further down the ticket. And so ensuring that voters know enough about our candidates is really important, particularly in a presidential year where there is enormous sums of money being spent on advertisements and in TV in these battleground states. One of the things that the sort of low information about our ballot level means is that voters are at times going to the polls and not voting all the way down their ticket, right? They may show up for the presidential, but they're not going all the way down to their state legislative race. And that is some of the work that is really required of us, is how do we string all of that together so that the volunteers and the folks at the doors that are not our candidates are talking about our candidates, that folks in the community understand that in their backyard, they have a candidate running for office who will stand up for them in their state house and will be able to make progress on the issues that they care deeply about. None of these issues are solely solved in a federal or a state way. And so when we think about the issues that are coming up across this country in this election, making progress for women and for people on reproductive health care and abortion access happens in the state until, right, Congress can act and have a federal law. So we've got a lot going on, but those are some of the dynamics that we're thinking about in these really nested, important battleground states.
Yeah, maybe do you talk a little bit more about those issues you're hearing about as your folks are knocking doors? I mean, it sounds like you feel like choice is going to be a big thing that draws people out. That's going to be a motivating factor. Are there other issues you're seeing across the country or is it depending on the state that you feel like is going to drive turnout?
Yeah, voters' access to information is sort of ever present, right? So the national issues that I think we all hear about, right, from abortion to I think components of climate and ensuring that our kids are safe in schools, thinking about how we can make progress on things like the rising cost of healthcare or of childcare. Sorry, there's a lot.
Probably both, actually. Probably both.
Yes, 100%. Yes, both. Right, the rising cost of things.
Yeah.
We see those issues show up. What's interesting, I think, about our ballot level and the fact that it is our candidates or our electeds, right, who are on the doors, leading these conversations with voters, is that we see how they impact a community. So in a state where there has been an abortion ban and clinics have been closing or access to doctors has lessened, like that may be the way abortion shows up in that community. For places that have expanded reproductive freedoms and now have more access to clinics and more access to doctors, like building upon that, maybe how that issue shows up. I think the other thing on the abortion issue is that right can be taken away with the flip of a legislature, right? So they're really dynamic. Climate, right? Same thing. It's like, how do we solve for climate? How do we protect our communities and our environment? So we get those national issues. They show up with a community focus, but we also, right, very much get local issues. I know in Arizona, they're hearing a lot about water, the scarcity of water and the protection of it. And how do we make sure that we've got robust plans to secure water, housing, there's a lot of things that kind of show up based on the community. But I think more than anything, the issues that, we're all talking about and hearing about are showing up, and they're just showing up deeply rooted in the communities because these candidates are so connected to where they live.
Yeah, absolutely. And just maybe one more question on the choice issue. It just comes to mind about, there's so many, so many states that have ballot initiatives on the choice issue, right? And I just was talking to someone from Nebraska who are the competing ballot initiatives on the ballot with choice. We've seen across the country in the 22 cycle, certainly where, voters turned out in big numbers, even in red states on that issue. So I'm thinking about places like Arizona in particular, where you said that that's one of your target states. Like, how do you think about those kind of in concert, right? Is there coordination, or how does that factor into your thinking about where there's something else on the ballot that either is going to be a good thing for Democrats that they're going to want to come out for, or things that are going to motivate Democrats to come out and vote against?
Yeah, it's a great question. We think about the dynamics of any given state, what's on the ballot, what offices are on the ballot, in addition to what initiatives are on the ballot, and what do we think that may do to the electorate? What do we think that may do to turnout? And, at the end of the day, our goal is to get to 50+1 and to talk to our voters that are necessary to get there, right? And I think having abortion on the ballot and giving voters the opportunity to explicitly state that abortion should be protected in their state is really important. We also know that without leaders in our state capitals who will continue to fight for the broad sort of swath of reproductive health care, the initiative is important and really valid, but it's not going to do enough to ward off the fights that Republicans are putting up against women and against decision-making around how, if, when someone has a family.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to zoom out for a second if I can, and talk a little bit about all things legislatures, but essentially, one question I have for you is, and I've been doing this a long time too at the state and local level. So I have my own thoughts on this, but I feel like, I'll share my thoughts. I feel like that maybe, over time, people have finally started to understand why it's important at the state legislative level. Like, you've been doing this a long time, which I want to dive into how kind of your own career and path, but later, I feel like at one point people just, kind of thought if everything was happening at the federal level, all attention was on Congress. Certainly the money that was flowing to congressional races versus state and local races was, it was a kind of making that point. So I'm just curious kind of about your vision over the time you've worked in state legislative races. Like, has that changed? Do you feel like there's more attention? Do you feel like there's more understanding of why this is important?
Yeah, I feel like it's changed drastically, right? I think Dobbs was an important moment in that, but I think that it started before then, right? You started to see more national coverage on what was happening in our state capitals. And that coverage starts to bring to life the kinds of things that can happen in state capitals. It's not just sort of rote, boring regulations. It's real things that impact people's everyday lives and their communities. And it can happen quickly, right? The system is set up to ensure that our states can tackle problems, solve them fast, and make changes and iterations to them as they need along the way. So I think that robust system has been better incorporated in all kinds of communication, from national news to, I think what we may consume across the internet. The Dobbs decision, I think, was such an important moment because I think it did two things. One, it told people that decisions about their body could be made in their state capitals, and it widened people's understanding of what Roe protected, right? I think for so many people, the baseline understanding was Roe protected an abortion. But I think as we're seeing, Roe didn't just protect the abortion in the sense of, I'm in a position and I want to choose whether or not to have a family. It also protected necessary procedures for people who were miscarrying or who had an ectopic pregnancy, or like other really important healthcare decisions. And I think that understanding, coupled with better reporting on what was happening in our state capitals, has supercharged people's baseline understanding of why the state legislative races and why what's happening in our state capitals is so important.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think it's like this message coming from the Republicans of like, we're just going to let states decide, and yes, that was about Dobbs, but actually increasingly, the Supreme Court did the same thing on some climate change effort, right? And some other things. So it's like, oh, wait a minute, this is all going to get, put down to the state, then I better have the people in the state capitals that, to your point, that are going to be doing what I think that we should do. So do you feel like, how is that translated, and how is the, can only be described as a pretty polarized, environment. And we both work with elected officials all year long, and we know the kind of stress they're under and the kind of scrutiny they're under and the kind of threats they're under. And, in this increasingly polarized environment, have you seen any change in your ability to recruit candidates who want to come run for state legislature?
That's a really interesting question. So most of the candidate filing deadlines, sort of were the end of Q1 this year. So think March, maybe beginning of April. And if you think about where we were politically in this country and sort of what the ticket looked like, it's very different than what it does today. And I note that because, in North Carolina, we talked a little bit earlier about how Democrats are currently in the super minority, but they recruited candidates in every one of their Senate districts that's up and in all but one of their House districts. These folks raised their hand to run for office in a place where Democrats are not currently in power, and where their work with voters was going to be hard. And the reality is many of them, are unlikely to win. But you don't win if you don't try, and you don't change the tide of a community and show them that you're here for them, that there are people who want to run for office, who care about their community, and who are looking at how to solve the big problems and take advantage of the big opportunities that we have in our communities and in this country. So I think that's like one example, and it's kind of interesting to think about like what it means. They recruited candidates in every district in Michigan, had really strong candidate recruitment in so many of these places. And so even though things are polarized, and even though the news is perpetually heavy and scary, and I think at times the tasks ahead feel really daunting, we still have great people who are raising their hand to run for office. And I think there's two things that signifies. One, people are willing to do the work, they're willing to lead, they're willing to try. And two, when we think about what it means to be a leader in your state capital, we think about the leadership for their community, but we also know that, roughly 40% of Democratic governors were former legislators, and that 50% of Congress came out of the legislature. This work is really important. It builds the foundation of leadership skills and experience doing really important things for our communities that gives these leaders an opportunity not only to continue to serve in their community and their state, but also, take on other opportunities and, move throughout our elected offices.
Yeah. Well, here on all that. New Deal, of course, feels this exact same way. And we're very proud that 1 in 4 of our state and local leaders have gone on to higher office. So, and we have 3 people running for governor this year, 8 people running for Congress. So, including Josh Stein, who you mentioned. So we completely agree on that pipeline point you're making right there. Absolutely. Tell me a little bit about how you got into this work. You've been at the DLCC in a variety of capacities over a number of years, but like what first drew you to this? Is this kind of you thought you were going to be president of the DLCC when you were in junior high? I doubt it, because we didn't know what the DLCC was in junior high, probably. How did this happen for you?
Yeah, I feel I grew up in the Midwest in Minnesota. I moved around a bunch, not from a very political family, but I think from a family that, experienced government in lots of different ways. And as a kid, it caught my eye, right? Like seeing how government can work for our communities, for our school, for our children, and how it can't, right? Was something that interests me. So I went to college in Iowa, in Des Moines. And at the time, it was a very robust political environment, and it was very easy to raise your hand and get involved in a campaign, truly at any level of the ballot. We had presidential candidates coming all over the place all the time. It was very tangible. It was very real. And so I thought that maybe that's what I'd like to do. And actually, I mentioned it to a professor who was sort of like, you don't have the connections, or right, you're not from the type of family that gets to work in politics. Like that's kind of reserved, right, for people with privilege. Not exactly the words, but the sentiment of it, right? And I was like, okay, I'm going to do it anyways, right?
Let's stop there and just say, what the heck? But okay, that's such a terrible message. I did not come from a privilege. I mean, that's a crazy message. That's not true. But anyway, I can't believe someone said that to you.
But I think for many people, the idea of working in politics and being able to dedicate a career to this part of our system, right? To supporting the elected leaders who go on to lead, to create really strong policies for our communities, is something that many folks just don't fully understand is right, like our real jobs. And I feel like truly, like I was a little bit naive in understanding that myself. And so I started to volunteer, and then I sort of landed in the Iowa Senate, and there was such a tangible component to understanding the impacts that the work that they were doing in the state capitol had on people's lives and how quickly they were able to solve problems. And I fell in love with the work and never looked back. And it's always been, almost always been on the political side. I think electing really strong leaders who then go on to solve really big problems is a really joyful thing. And we've got lots of challenges and lots of opportunities, as I said, in this country. So it's been great.
Yeah, that's so wonderful. And I want to connect 2 dots that you just have been talking about. One is your own personal story of finding your path and finding out that you could make a difference and be part of this, work. And then also what you're talking about recruiting candidates, which I agree with you. We have seen, we don't work on the campaign side, of course, but we see the elected officials who are elected, sometimes are stepping up, not even because, in spite of what's happening, but because of what's happening. They're saying, like, actually, this is my way to serve. I see the dysfunction. I see the need for people to step up. And so I'm so heartened and inspired by that. But one thing that we didn't touch on yet is how many, the changing demographics and nature of the people who are being elected. And I'd be curious about your thoughts on this. But it kind of made me think of it when you were talking about your own journey, which is I feel like there's so many more women and people of color and people who've been so traditionally not in these offices running and winning. And it's super exciting to see that, this America that's looking, these legislatures and other offices looking more like America. So is that, are you seeing that? And are you seeing that in your candidates this year in particular?
Yeah, I actually love this question so much. I'm going to take us back just a tiny bit. When Democrats lost in 2010 and so many state legislatures moved from Democratic to Republican, it was more than 20 that year. It obviously wiped out, roughly 1,000 members. And that meant that new people had to run for office, right? And there was a real transition in that time, sort of in a post-2010 environment where folks were raising their hand to run for office in situations where they weren't in the majority, where their leadership was going to have to be really smart and steadfast. And it was going to be hard because they were going to have to bring along a caucus or bring along a community, right? In an environment where they didn't have the power to determine what the agenda was. They didn't have enough votes to pass the perfect policy. But with that, what we saw is an ushering in of many more women and people of color and a much more diverse representative subset of legislators across the country. And that's been growing since then. In fact, in 2022 and in 2023, the legislative chambers, the House chambers that we won, so in Michigan and Pennsylvania and in Virginia, all elected Black speakers. The tangibleness of what it means for people to be represented by someone who looks like them or a group of people who represent the fabric of their community and their state is so important. Those voices and those lived experiences showing up in our public policy, I'm just not sure that there's anything more important than that.
Yeah, and to your point earlier, then those speakers and those legislators go on to be congresspeople and governors, and so we really see it all the way through the pipeline. So I think that that's absolutely right, and it is super exciting to see and well overdue. And we can have a whole nother half an hour conversation about why that may have triggered some of the backlash on the other side, but we'll put a pin in that and focus on the upside of things. And so maybe in closing, we're not very far from the election. What's your heart of hearts tell you? How optimistic are you? What should people be watching?
I think my heart of heart tells me, we've got a little less than 4 weeks and there's still time for people to get involved, right? These are races that are close to our communities with candidates who still live in their districts. They show up and go to school or drop off their kids or go get gas with members of these communities. And if folks listening, and I know you've got such a great audience of people who are already engaged, don't forget to get involved, bring your friends along with you. There's so many important things that still need to happen over these next 4 weeks to put us over the finish line. So I think I'm an operative who loves this time and is also, deeply recognizes that we're not there yet, right? We're not done. We must get to November. We must have done everything that we possibly could, kind of laid it all out there so that voters have the best information they can have till they vote, right? So I guess my plea is get involved. Head to DLCC.org if you're interested in where or how you can get involved in your state. And there's a lot more work to do, but I think we're on the right side of this.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for spending time in this very busy time for you. And we are going to have our fingers and toes crossed. And not only just our fingers and toes crossed, we're going to do something. We're going to run through the finish line, like you said, and we're going to get to the other side of this. But thank you so much for spending some time with us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
An Honorable Profession is a New Deal Leaders podcast. Thanks to the team at NewDEAL for producing this episode. We encourage you to bring honor to public service, and because we keep things honorable, no tax dollars are used in the making of this podcast.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.